Hey everybody! Sorry for the extended wait. This is Genesis 3 in Skeptical Linguist Bible Studies. I thought Genesis 2 took a long time to study and understand, and it did. Genesis 3, though, once you really get into all of the stuff that's going on, figuratively, mythologically, this is so tremendous. There is so much going on under the surface, under the literal story. And you could really do a whole college course just on Genesis 3, I think, with all of the symbolism being used and all of the tangents that it connects to. This is complex stuff. Buckle in. Let's go. We're starting in verse 1, of course, which says, "Now the serpent was more cunning than any beast of the field which Yahweh God had made. And he said to the woman, 'Indeed, has God said, ye shall not eat of every tree of the garden?'" Seems like a pretty straightforward verse, but when we are reading this as a literal thing, that's one thing. It's easy to take a story about a serpent and a tree and just tell the story. Most people take stories like this as extended allegories, metaphors, though. And the symbolism in this story is so deep and so rife with all kinds of implication that it would do a real disservice to just treat this as a literal narrative. The literal narrative is very easy to defeat. Serpents don't talk, things like that. There's certainly been no evidence of serpents with vocal cords or anything like that. It's easy until you run into the intellectual powerhouse answers in Genesis. Of course. Come up against Ken Ham and he will knock you down. But let's discuss the symbolism first so we can get some idea of how it might be interpreted if you're not a Ken Hammer. Ken Hammer. Oh, he should go with that. So there's two possible etymologies for this serpent word, nachash in Hebrew. The first one is a root word that means sorcery. And another is a root word that means lion. In Akkadian, there's a word for snake that means ground lion. And that's interesting, but the root word for sorcery and the word for snake are actually pronounced the same, nachash. And this indicates that there may be some mythology or superstition about the evil of snakes, the sorcery adjacent snake. The root word is also used in a verb form, meaning to practice divination. That's fortune telling. So what do snakes represent? In various mythologies, you've got fertility, there's rebirth, that's the shedding of the skin, death when you shed the skin, life when you have your new skin, and then there's the Ouroboros or Ouroboros, where the snake is eating its own tail. It's the circle of life and death. One interesting psychological thing I read about this was exploring why serpents are so often used as symbols in initiations to cults. And surprising how often that motif shows up. Primates, according to this theory, are, scared of snakes. They represent death to snakes. They're kind of the biggest problem Go to Australia and you'll understand why. So as a symbol of death to your old life and rebirth into your new life, that's why. So that's an interesting theory. I think it makes sense. Other things that it represents: evil, the underworld, sorcery, of course, treachery, as in the serpent stealing Gilgamesh's fruit of life and condemning him to be mortal. Interesting parallels there. Nehebkau, I think you pronounce it, is the Egyptian snake that guards the Egyptian underworld, specifically a tree. Snakes and trees are a big motif too. We should talk about that. There's a snake that guards Buddha as he sits under the Bodhi tree. And he spreads, it's a cobra, and he spreads his hood over Buddha so that he is shielded from the torrential rain and is able to acquire wisdom. It just occurred to me that one of Yahweh's possible things is a storm god. I know I said war and metallurgy before. I was doing some more research on it, and apparently he was a god of storms too. Different times, of course, these things change. Celts think that snakes come from the ground and are connected to all of the earth and hold great wisdom. A lot of wisdom associated with snakes. The Hopi think that they represent an umbilical cord connecting us to the earth. Of course, do remember that Sumerian, Babylonian, Egyptian myths predate the writing, at the very least, of the Hebrew myths. So it seems likely that these informed the Hebrew myths rather than the other way around. Of course, that's a heretical thing to say, but, it matches up with the timing. More snakes and trees. There's Nidhogg, I think you pronounce it. It's the Norse snake that guards Yggdrasil, the world tree. There's the serpent Ladon, I think it's pronounced, in Greek mythology, that guards the entheogenic fruit tree in the Garden of Hesperides. There's, of course, the Gilgamesh one. There's the vision serpent in Mayan mythology that guards the vision tree. That's Mayan. That guards the world tree. The world tree connects the spiritual and the physical. There's a bunch of these things. So, again, it's worth understanding the allegorical interpretations of this book rather than just the literal ones, because, like it or not, mythology has meaning. If you haven't heard of Joseph Campbell, this is a guy you should really check out. If you're here, you'll certainly love him. He's a lot better than I am at parsing this stuff out. He's a comparative mythologist, or rather was a comparative mythologist. Takes a look at the symbolism in one religion and what it means psychologically, and compares it to the symbolism for the same thing in another religion, and shows how the symbols shift shapes and shift meanings, and how most of these religions have the same content in different symbolic forms. It's fantastic, fascinating stuff. Check him out. Hero with 1,000 Faces, The Hero's Journey. All this stuff is amazing, and there is going to be quite a few times I think we'll bring up The Hero's Journey in this series. As far as the literal snake, okay, so what happens? We've got a serpent that is more cunning than all the beasts of the field, and he goes to Eve, the woman, and says, "Hey, did God really say you can't eat from all the trees?" Now, right away, we've got a talking snake. And that raises some questions, of course. Snakes, as discussed, do not have voice boxes. There's not been any discoveries that show that snakes were able to talk. So why weren't they surprised by this? Why is this so passé that a snake opened its mouth and words came out of it that humans could understand? Of course, number one, it's not a literal tale. That's one interpretation. Of course, this is just a Aesop's fable type thing, right? Number two, animals didn't talk, but they experienced a lot of strange things at this time, so none of this was unusual for them. Interested in how language originated in this storyline. It just came built in somehow. I suppose that's entirely possible from a theistic God can do anything he likes perspective. That's very likely not how language originated in the historical linguist studies. Of course, people started coming up with, well, it's a little bit speculative, so I don't want to say that, there's hard evidence that it didn't come built into humans, but it does seem pretty unlikely, and we could get into why, but it's not going to make a difference to a theist, so who cares, right? So another interpretation, it was actually surprising to them that there was a talking snake, but they didn't mention it. Or, the Bible doesn't mention it, or something. Maybe they were just being polite. Hey, of course the snake can talk. Don't be racist. Something like that. You're very well spoken for a snake. Racist. So, another one is, of course, animals were talking all the time. Maybe this was freaking Narnia, And, the snake's not the only talking animal in the Bible. You've got Balaam's donkey, and I think there's a couple other ones. So maybe this is not a huge surprise to them, because they were carrying on conversations with all kind of animals. Hey, maybe that's why God thought the other animals might be a good helpmeet for him, because he could talk to them. Maybe. I don't know how that ability fell off, but we haven't really discovered, the right kind of larynx for such things. But, that's neither here nor there for a God can do anything theist. So, shrewd or crafty? Let's get into the words here. Arum. This is the same word as naked in Genesis 2. Very strange. So naked and shrewd kind of mean the same thing. How does this work? Are they homonyms? Or is craftiness and shrewdness something you should be ashamed of? Well, so arum means naked, which is from the word which means to be bare. Arum means crafty, which is from the word arom, which is naked, from which is to be bare. So they are connected. I was studying this a little bit and found some interesting stuff. The English illustration I would use is the word reveal, from to veil, a covering. So perhaps this is about not having a veil in your mind concealing things. So you're shrewd because the things that there are to know are not covered up. So who was more mentally naked then? It would be the snake. Adam and Eve didn't have a veil over their bodies, and the snake didn't have a veil of ignorance over his mind. Get it? It could also be, of course, that the serpent was more physically naked than any other beast of the field, since they had fur and stuff. Maybe there's a reason it was chosen for the symbol for shrewdness, because it was more naked than these other things. The Bible, especially Old Hebrew, really likes its wordplay. So, it's possible. It's very ambiguous, though. It's cryptic stuff if you're taking it literally. The beasts of the field are animals that roam the plains and forests and stuff. It's mostly mammals, so comparing a reptile to a beast of the field is strange, but okay. They didn't know any better, I guess. So, indeed, has God said. The wording basically says, did God really say you can't eat from all the trees? Now, religious people come to this verse all the time to say Satan's biggest thing is casting doubt on whether God really said or means something that he said. Which is kind of ironic because it is skepticism that earns us reliable scientific progress. When you question things, you get to poke and prod at them and see if they stand up to the scrutiny. And you get to decide if they're good enough when you can't topple them. This is kind of one of the big epistemological and relatively ethical differences between a skeptical and a religious worldview. It is arrogant to question God in one sense, and in another, it is arrogant to trust yourself and your own religious experiences so deeply. This is one of the biggest things that caused the separation in my life from religion. But enough of that. Religious people like to point out that the serpent here frames us negatively, whereas God frames it positively. So the serpent says, hey, did God really say you can't eat from all the trees? Whereas God said you can eat from all the trees, except for this one. I don't see why it's a problem that Satan said that, though, because it's true. Whether you frame it negatively or positively, it is true that they can't eat from all the trees. That is a true proposition in that framework. You can't eat from all the trees? No, you can't. So I don't know why they do that. Anyway, on to verse 2. And the woman said to the serpent, the fruit of the trees of the garden we may eat, but the fruit of the tree which is in the middle of the garden, God has said, you shall not eat it, nor shall you touch it, lest you die. Now, there's no linguistic stuff here. It all translates pretty neatly into English, but some other points. Number 1, nor shall you touch it. This wasn't part of the original instructions. Some people think Adam had told her, God said, don't even touch that one, sort of, as a way of telling her to not bother with that one. So, similar to how we would say, don't even go there, don't even touch that. I ain't even touching that. That sort of thing. I don't know why God didn't tell the woman, too. Maybe he did, and it's just not in the story, right? Now, as before, if death entered the world through sin, and they hadn't sinned yet, they'd have had no concept of what death was. So, to be as kind as possible to Genesis, we should assume that there was death, since they apparently did understand the concept, and they understood decay, since they had to tend the garden, even in Eden, pre-sin, and that death didn't actually enter the world through sin, as Romans 5:12 claims. The word death doesn't mean just death for man, though, so there's a contradiction that this dredges up. But we haven't gotten to the New Testament yet, so let's just be as kind to Genesis as we can and say that sin and death were already in the world. Okay? Or maybe they were told what death was, having had a whole lot of conversations with God who had not yet invented it. Or maybe animals and plants did die, and death only entered the world of humans through sin, but as I said, that's not what that word means. Also, it doesn't add up because the fall affected the animals. So, problems there. On to verse 4. And serpent said to the woman, you will not surely die. Verse 5. For God knows that in the day you eat of it, then your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. One interesting linguistic thing here. Surely die is an okay translation, but Hebrew uses two forms of the word meaning to die twice in a row. This is an emphatic thing. A better translation is dying you shall die. So it's not that weird. We say things like, you gonna get good and dead, or dead as fuck, or, oh, you mad, right? So think of it that way. Open eyes, pretty universal metaphor for being aware, and that's the case here as well. So this all speaks for itself. No weird linguistic stuff that I could find. Verse 6. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food and pleasant to the eyes and desirable to make one wise, then she took of its fruit and ate. Dun, dun, dun. And she gave also to her husband with her, and he ate. And there's the fall. So pleasant actually means desire. So does the desirable word. So her eyes desired the fruit, and she desired wisdom. To make wise is from a word meaning prudence. The story's still telling itself here. So easy peasy on to verse 7. And the eyes of the two of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed together fig leaves and made themselves coverings. Still fine in the translation. No weirdness there. Plenty of weirdness in the content, though. So let's go back to the concept of nudity. Every single animal had exposed bits. They're all naked all the time. So is this saying nudity was good and covering it was bad, and they chose to do something bad by covering themselves? Or is it saying that nudity was bad and covering it was good because modesty is good even though you're not around other people? Also, there was no such concept as clothing, and nudity is a lack of clothing. So how does the knowledge of good and evil make them aware of their lack of clothing? How does the knowledge of good and evil make them aware of a lack of something that hadn't yet been invented? Clothing must be part of the good and evil matrix, I guess. The commentaries have something to say about this, of course. So, one interpretation is they already had the knowledge of good and evil, but they didn't have evil inclinations in them. Temptation to evil was, up to that point, external, and now it was in them, now that they had eaten the fruit. The knowledge of good and evil was an internal tendency toward not just good, but now also evil. Of course, that's not what knowledge is. Knowledge is not temptation. But sure, that is one way to square that circle. So now they had lustful temptations and wanted to get it on when they saw each other's bits, right? And that made them ashamed for some reason. Why is shame so tied to lust? This is a big question for a lot of religions to contend with, I think. Is it because shame is painful and we want to have immediate gratification to distract from the shame? That's what one Christian response said. Is it because we're trained to be ashamed of our sexuality by religion? Remember, this was written around 750 BC, and that's long after civilization had flourished. So, there had been plenty of time for religion to have been internalized and to tie sex to shame. What exactly is wrong with being naked, and what exactly is wrong with desiring someone else's body? When my girl notices I'm naked, my reaction isn't shame. She's seen me naked lots of times. There's no reason to cover myself. If she wants to check me out, let her. Only good things will arise. She's my partner. And so I don't see what the problem is. And so to me, this bit doesn't make any sense, but it does give me a cause to rant. So buckle in for the rant, folks. Sexual desire is wild, wacky, and wonderful. It goes all over the place, pulling in psychological quirks and needs related to self-worth and power and lack of power and all the dynamics that go with that, secrecy, taboos, disgust, anything and everything can be pulled into your sexuality. And healthy attitudes are important here. Healthy attitudes toward others, of course, being paramount. Healthy attitudes toward yourself, absolutely necessary. And a healthy appetite for sex. Healthy appetite. Balance is key. In many religions, lust is a major sin. In fact, it's one of the 7 deadly sins. Jesus says, if you even lust after someone you're not married to, it's pretty much the same thing as actual adultery. So, as a result, people are doing their best to constantly push these thoughts away. But the thing is, they're not just thoughts. They're biological urges hardwired into our base code. The writers of the Bible didn't know that, of course. So they just thought it was all a matter of discipline. They also didn't live very long lives, so they didn't have the time to turn into dirty old men. So, neurons that fire together in the brain form stronger and stronger connections the more times they fire together. Neurons that fire together wire together, as they say. Example, Pavlov's dog. This means if every time you feel sexual, you immediately fire up the neurons for guilt and shame, you are wiring your brain to associate sexuality with guilt and shame. This is why many people who save themselves for marriage find out that when it comes time for sex, it's panic attack time. Everything about it feels wrong. No matter how much they know it's finally all right to do it, and their brain has been physically altered to create that response. The really bad thing, though, is it can work in the opposite way as well. It's not just that when you feel sexual, you feel guilt and shame. It's that guilt and shame themselves connect back to sexuality, too. So if you start getting a sexual thrill when you feel guilt and shame, you're not going to feel like you're having good sex without the associated feelings of guilt and shame. So it's missing something dangerous and wrong if you just have healthy, normal human sex in a sex-positive atmosphere. Now, tie into that religion's very commonplace obsession with female virginity and purity. And things really start to get toxic. You're shoving all these biologically hardwired urges into a pressure cooker and ignoring them and letting them fester. And they curdle and they get rancid and desperate. And it only gets stronger with time, and that's by design. Your sexuality is fiercely opposed to purity now, and it wants to hurt the purity, to take revenge on it. Besides, there's nothing more dangerous or wrong, and nothing inspires more guilt and shame than violating innocence. Violating the most pure thing you can violate. So I ask, seriously, is it any wonder why child abuse is so very high among the very religious? Think about that. Or maybe some are the type that think there's nothing more dangerous or wrong and more worthy of inspiring guilt and shame than homosexuality. And maybe that's why so many of these preachers hammer away on homosexuality and then get caught in a bathroom with some grinder date or male hooker. Well, all of this starts right here in Genesis 3. Of course they were ashamed. They were naked. You should be ashamed of your nudity, too. It's assumed that everyone is going to be ashamed when they're naked. Unless, of course, you're with your spouse. Except for, in this case, for some reason. Let's move on to verse 8. And they heard the sound of Yahweh God walking in the garden in the breeze of the day, and hid themselves, Adam and his wife, from the presence of Yahweh God among the trees of the garden. There's some interesting stuff in this verse. Walking. Was God walking on feet? This word is also used for going, and it's used for rivers. Rivers walk in the same way as this verb. So it doesn't have to be footsteps necessarily, but they heard it, so it was audible. In the breeze of the day. Breeze, ruach again. Ruach Elohim from Genesis 1. This means breath or wind. We'll call it moving air. Don't need to worry about which phrase this connects to. In the breeze of the day is where and when they heard the sound of God moving, or they heard a sound which was of God moving in the breeze of the day. A special kind of wind, maybe. From what I can understand, God was moving in the garden and in the breeze of the day. There's a theory that yom here, the word for day, means storm, which connects the word yom to the Akkadian word umu, storm. But that doesn't work because it's demons that move in storms in Akkadian mythology. So, possible interpretations. God was coming wrathfully in a breeze, like an Akkadian demon, full of wrath. What's going on here? Or God was taking a stroll through the garden in the cool of the day, which is afternoon, twilight, early evening. God was moving however God moves through the garden in the cool of the day. Okay, whatever. Either way, whatever God was doing, it was audible, meaning he had a physical effect on his surroundings, which is more evidence for God being a physical being. That's all we've seen of God thus far, is that he's physical. Of course, that's going to cause some problems later when he's a spirit and corporal, and nobody's seen or heard him. So also they hid themselves, which, that's strange. That indicates that they could hide from him, meaning if you're hiding from somebody, that person has eyes and no X-ray vision, so this wasn't even Superman. It turns out they were right about that. Verse 9, and Yahweh God called to Adam and said, "Where are you?" There's no linguistic notes on verse 9, but God either knew where they were and was just saying this as a pretense to get them to come out, so essentially lying, or God didn't know where they were. There's also another very cringy explanation. He wasn't asking where they were physically. He was making a statement about man's moral orientation in relation to God. Where, oh, where has your spirit gone in relation to me? Or he was making Adam think about where he was versus where he should be. I should be out there enjoying myself, but I'm hiding in the bushes. What have I done? All of that is speculative, and I think it's pretty cringy and dumb. But God was doing all sorts of physical things. Probably walking on his feet here. He had a mouth that blows breath later. We know that he has a butt. So why shouldn't he have eyes? Why not? There's no omnipresent stuff anywhere in this passage. So translations that say otherwise and make all these guesses are doctoring what's written here. And it's pretty far-fetched to try to make this work with later passages. I think you could really do a great service to yourself by admitting that this shouldn't be taken literally. Verse 10. And he said, this is Adam speaking now, and he said, I heard your voice in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, and I hid myself. Well, that's illogical. But first, the linguistics. Your voice. It doesn't have to be voice. It could also mean sound. So maybe he heard the sound of God. But God did speak out loud, so he probably heard his voice. So why would Adam be afraid of God seeing him naked? That's the big logical problem here. God's looking for him, and Adam doesn't want him to know what's going on, so he hides his genitals. God had seen his genitals lots of times. That's a really dumb idea. The cock's out of the bag, dude. So he was literally created that way. So you've been naked around this guy for your whole life, and if you want to hide what you're done, why not just be nonchalant? Pretend like nothing's happening. Whistle a tune. So, verse 11, and he said, "Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree that I told you not to eat from?" Nothing linguistic about this one. The logic, though, is poor. Again, nudity is the absence of clothing, and clothing didn't exist. There's no possible frame of reference for lack of clothing. Unless lack of clothing is evil and they just didn't know it. To the pure, all things are pure, right? So if it was shame about it, that it was evil, then clothing isn't necessary, and Bible believers should be nudists, right? And there's a lot of Christian naturists who take that logic. Imagine going to a Christian naturist church full of old warbling ladies singing the Old Rugged Cross, though. No thanks. Maybe it's a good thing that they wear their frocks. One article I read posits that they were aware of their partner's ability to check them out sexually, and that they could be seen as sexual objects, which made them kind of blushy and shy about it. But one would assume God created them with fully functional genitals designed for sexual intercourse. Why would he make a fully functional reproductive system if they didn't think to get it on? The other animals had already been given the command to be fruitful and multiply, so they'd seen sex happen, I would assume. The animals aren't particularly shy about getting it on in front of an audience. So if the other animals were having sex, the idea must have occurred to them, hey, thing go in hole, right? That same article goes on to suggest something a little more sophisticated, though. It says that sex and desire was a good thing, and what was wrong was the desire to cover up. These are my private parts. I'm going to have this idea to maybe withhold my private parts from someone else. So it wasn't sex and desire that was bad, but withholding sex and desire from your partner by covering up. That was what was bad. Withdrawing into oneself. That's an interesting analysis, and it made me think, but I don't think it quite fits, because God asks them, who told you you were naked? As if it's a piece of information. It's knowledge, not wisdom, not psychology. Knowledge or information that could be conveyed by telling. So I don't think that quite fits. There isn't a very good way to square this circle. They didn't know about clothes, so if they became aware of their lack of clothing, they would have had to become aware of clothing. They knew their bits were out and what the bits were for, since other animals' bits were out, and they saw what they did with them. So there was no cause for shame about it, since there were no norms against it. And they'd been seeing that stuff their whole lives. So the only knowledge that could have told them they were naked would be, number one, knowledge that their private parts were out, which they already knew and thought nothing of. It would be psychology and non-existent social norms that told them to be ashamed of it. Number two, knowledge that clothes were an option, which they weren't. None of this works. Verse 12, and the man said, the woman who you gave to be with me, she gave me of the tree, and I ate. And God said to the woman, verse 13, what is this you have done? And the woman said, the serpent deceived me, and I ate. First, real quick, I seem to have missed a spot in Genesis 2. The word ezer, helper. It doesn't mean helper necessarily. It means to rescue or to be strong. It's translated as helper in the concordances, by which I've been somewhat led astray. So, it should be noted in these verses that God doesn't blame the woman in the story. This whole, hey, that helper you made for me, it's her fault, and God's, yours, by extension. That doesn't work on God. Still, though, here we have a source for a bunch of anti-woman nonsense that's done a lot of damage to women. Big problem for women here. Tertullian, one of the church fathers of Roman Catholicism, said women are the devil's gateway, the unsealer of that forbidden tree, the first deserter of the divine law. Women being created after men meant she wasn't strictly necessary either. And the translation of helper means assistant, literally second class to man's first class, baked into the theology here. The fact that she messed up the job creates resentment. She was created to help me, and instead she ran me amok. Of course, women being created after man wouldn't mean she was inferior, right? Because, after all, man was created after the animals, and man wasn't inferior to the animals, so that doesn't make much sense. Then came the Malleus Maleficarum. Infamous book, translates to The Witch Hammer. This was a book published in 1487 that leans very heavily on Genesis 3 for its extremely anti-woman stance. By the way, maleficarum, that's a female word in Latin. The gender-neutral or male form would be maleficorum. So telling that it's about females. So what's this book about? There's a papal bull as used as proof that witches do in fact exist, because the Pope said it, so it's got to be true. That's a somewhat controversial stance in 1487, but Pope Innocent VIII authorizes the authors here to do whatever they need to do to combat witchcraft. The main text says what witchcraft is, how it works, how they make their services needed, how they recruit, how to do a witch trial, how to torture witches, and how to sentence them. Nice stuff. Theological concepts in the book. Number one, witches are more often women than men, because women are more susceptible to temptation because of the manifest weaknesses of their sex. It takes a woman to tempt a man, you see, but women are able to be tempted by the devil. Women are prone to believing, and because the demon basically seeks to corrupt their faith, he assails them in particular, it says. They also have a temperament towards flux and loose tongues. They are defective in all the powers of both soul and body, and are stated to be more lustful than men. This is all very damning for women. Witches have the power to steal your penis. That's good. They also love cannibalism and infanticide. Everything in this theology has a yin and yang sort of thing. There's a good thing and a bad thing, an opposite. One positive, one negative. The bad thing needs to be destroyed and punished and feared. Perfection is not a holistic approach. It is not balanced. It is the purging of the bad. This is another big difference between Eastern and Western and secular and Judeo-Christian values. What perfection actually is and means. So the bad thing needs to be destroyed and punished and feared. There's God versus Satan. You've got Eve on the one hand being contrasted with Mary, the good woman. And, of course, men, the good ones, versus women, the bad ones. Yeah. And that extends to married and chaste women. They were less evil than prostitutes or loose women or concubines, but still, they are corrupted, corruptible, dangerous. And, in fact, most women are bound to become witches. Most women. This applies to most women. The only way to make sure that they're not going to become a witch is to make them become a nun. All this stuff comes out of Genesis 3. Even if it's not a particularly good interpretation. But it does show what happens when man leads and women are considered lesser. Men, once they have privilege, and this applies to anybody, once they have privilege, will tend to guard it jealously by any means necessary. And it can and has gotten cartoonishly nasty and absurd and ridiculous, as in the Maleficus Malacarum. So these ideas have carried on in one form or another. They're not things of the past, unfortunately. Not only did people like Martin Luther carry on these ideas into Protestantism, but they still exist to this day in modern papal encyclicals, and they definitely still exist in fundamentalism. I've experienced it firsthand. And I can assure you that fundamentalists are all about that shit. Men can discipline their wives for being insubordinate. Women need to be quiet. And if they have questions, go home and ask your husband. Women aren't allowed to teach men. On and on. As for the idea that this stuff sprung up not because of what the Bible says, but because sinful man misinterpreted it misogynistically. Well, okay, but we have to remember this stuff was written between 800 and 750 BC in a deeply patriarchal Canaan. If we pretend this was a real account and it was somehow uncorrupted by writers thousands of years later, then we could make decent arguments for equality from it, but that blatantly ignores the historical context in which this was written. This was written by misogynists for misogynists, period. That's just how it is. So to say there's no such message embedded there is to erase all the historical context and simply pretend. Verse 14. So Yahweh God said to the serpent, because you've done this, cursed are you more than all livestock and more than every beast of the field. On your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. It's almost Ken Ham time. Again. Linguistics in this. Livestock. Animals of the field. Animals in general or cattle. If it meant animal in general, though, the next part wouldn't be necessary to say so. Cattle. Let's say cattle. Beast of the field is the next one. Animals that like to be in open fields, meadows, and whatnot, mostly mammals. So, not more cursed than any other kind of animal? Just those kinds of animals? Interesting. Not sure exactly what that says. And grouping it in with beasts of the field and mammals and stuff doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But maybe snakes used to have legs. And this is where the Ken Ham stuff comes in. Now, dust you shall eat, real quick first. It's plausible that eating dust is a metaphor for being humbled. In Psalm 72, verse 9, it says the desert tribes will bow before him, and his enemies will lick the dust. And furthermore, snakes actually do taste the dust when they flick their tongues out. It's part of how they identify what's going on around them. So, on your belly you shall go. Ken Ham and a lot of creationists believe that this means the serpent didn't used to go on its belly, because it's a punishment to go on your belly. So, therefore, it had legs before, or wings, or some other way of going. Because of this, they've been searching for proof that snakes used to have legs. And a few years ago, they found their big news story. They've been grinning about it ever since. Tetrapodopus amplectus. But that is not a snake. The skull matches lizards, not snakes, number one. I've put an article in the description about this. Was the serpent itself really to blame, though? This is, I would really like to understand this. Because people say this was Satan. The story doesn't say it was Satan, it says the serpent. Now, we know serpents don't talk, but I guess if they used to have legs, maybe they used to have vocal cords too. I don't know why they're so obsessed with looking for legs. They really should be looking for vocal cords in their fossils. If Satan was inhabiting the serpent, as some people suggest, why would the serpent be punished? No, we have to blame all of snakes. So, it had to be a serpent. Verse 15, an enmity I will put between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. This translates neatly, again, in a literal sense, but there are a lot of possible readings of this, metaphorically and so on. One interpretation is this is the first gospel, a messianic message. Satan, which is the serpent somehow, will injure Jesus, and Jesus will crush the serpent's head. There is zero way to defend this interpretation, but somehow it's the most popular one. Satan doesn't crawl on his belly, even metaphorically. He's the prince of the power of this world, right? And he doesn't eat dust the rest of his life. He's the ruler of this world, so that doesn't add up. You could interpret it as Jesus will crush the head of the actual serpent, which is Jesus stepping on snakes. I don't think that's something we can take seriously. Another interpretation, man will crush the head of Satan metaphorically, which, of course, that doesn't work unless we can connect the serpent to Satan. And number 4, man and snake will be enemies. I think that's the most sensible one. Snakes can only attack around foot level, but man can stomp snakes, right? So it seems like that's the most sensible thing if we're going to interpret this literally. I want to introduce you to a concept called cooperativity. It's a linguistic concept, sort of encapsulated by a linguist named Grice. He came up with this set of rules called Grice's maxims. Really simply, this is an observation. When you're doing communication, the speaker and the listener are cooperating. They're talking about the same things. They're not misleading. They're not lying, etc. These are assumptions that interlocutors make about the conversation and each other. I don't want to get super into the nitty-gritty of it, but it's a little important here. Basically, there's 4 maxims of cooperativity, and it goes something like this. We assume the speaker is giving the required amount of information. We assume the speaker is telling the truth. We assume the speaker's communication is relevant to the context of the conversation. And we assume the speaker is being direct instead of squirrely. And we assume he's not hiding something by being ambiguous. I say all this to say that in the next few verses, God speaks of consequences to the other 2 beings and their descendants. It would be problematic for the condemnation message to be metaphysical in one sentence for the snake and then physical in the next 2. So if the whole snake part is metaphorical, then the next part should be metaphorical. That is how conversations work. You don't change the subject mid-conversation and go from metaphorical to literal. Unless you're a slippery politician, then you do that kind of shit all the time, right? For instance, let's say I say this. Okay, we'll just make something up. Jeff's going to pay off his debt with hard labor. As for Susan, Susan is going to pay $100,000 in restitution to the victims. And as for John, well, he's going to live paycheck to paycheck for the rest of his life. Okay, it would be very strange for me to be talking about a metaphorical Jeff in the first sentence, and some kind of metaphorical hard labor that he has to do, and then switch to the next two things being clearly not metaphorical, right? So, unless this is a particularly bad writing, we have to assume God is talking to a literal serpent, giving snakes in general a humiliating future because of the fact that one of the first snakes said a bad thing somehow without vocal cords. Verse 16. To the woman he said, greatly I will multiply your sorrow and your conception. In pain shall you bring forth children for your husband. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. Linguistics here, multiply means increase, same general idea as in English. Sorrow is toil or pain. It uses another word for pain right afterwards, though, so we should translate this as toil. And your conception. This is pregnancy and childbirth. But, so increase the strain and increase your pregnancy/childbirth? How does one increase pregnancy/childbirth, I wonder? A lot of translations say the pain and toil of childbirth and difficulty of pregnancy will be increased, but the translation here correctly says, and your conception. Made sure to look that up. Maybe it's a period of time that increases, like fewer months of pregnancy before. Now, of course, we don't know. Were they already having sex? It doesn't seem likely, because when Adam names Eve later on in the passage, he says, you will be the mother of all. So, if she had not yet conceived, she had no frame of reference for her punishment. This could be a logical error, multiplying by 0 and all. But it could be more like, hey, this was going to be relatively easy for you, but I guess you'll never know what you're missing out on. It's still a very odd thing that is said there. Your desire shall be for your husband. A lot of translations say your desire to control, aka you'll want to control your husband, but he will rule you. Now, that's not borne out at all by the word, which that word is not used all that often, actually. It's used in the Song of Solomon to describe sexual longing. And it's used in Genesis 4 to describe the desire of a beast to eat Cain in the field. It comes from the root word shug, which means attract, impel, of desire, affection. So, no, that's a bad interpretation. It should be taken the way it sounds. You gonna want the D, and that's a penis fly trap, yo, because you're gonna get totally owned because of that. Word? That's what it's saying. Forgive my stylings there. The logic here, I don't think there's a logical problem in that verse specifically, but maybe some ethical ones, right? The man made the same mistake as the woman, so why does she have to subordinate to the other as punishment for a mistake that they both made? Or, of course, this is just a fairy tale that fancifully describes the origin of the natural order of patriarchy as they knew it at the time of the writing. It's that, by the way. Verse 17, and to Adam, he said, because you have heeded the voice of your wife, I don't listen to her, and have eaten from the tree, of which I commanded you, saying you shall not eat of it, cursed is the ground for your sake. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Nothing to note here linguistically except for in toil. It's the same word used for Eve in contraception, which I guess further underscores that we should translate both as toil. The logic here. God invents agriculture as the first step for mankind. This has some problems with the, historical record. We know agriculture wasn't invented until long after hunter and gatherer setups. We know anatomically modern humans were around 200 to 300,000 years ago, but it wasn't until the last 10 to 12,000 years-ish that we started doing agriculture. Assuming, of course, that paleontologists and archaeologists know what they're talking about. Of course, Ken Ham and company scoff at the very idea that experts have expertise before becoming experts in their field. And again, Answers in Genesis comes to the attempted rescue here. They claim, of course, there was no hunter-gatherer period preceding agriculture. Cavemen, those are modern humans. They just happen to sometimes go in caves. They were totally advanced people, and they just needed some shelter from time to time. Might be distressing for them to take a look at the cave paintings. You're not going to find any vegetables on cave paintings, folks. You're going to find a lot of animals and a lot of hunting, and not nary a carrot to be found, right? So, yeah. Sorry, Mr. Ham, that's all a bunch of bull. Get it? Bull. So, yeah, agriculture is going to be harder than it was in the garden. And also hunting and gathering wasn't the sole thing going on for thousands of years, despite it being the sole thing depicted for thousands of years. Not super convincing, but hey. It's Ken Ham, what you gonna do? Verse 18, and both thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and ye shall eat the herb of the field. Linguistically, thorns and thistles might be an idiom for meaning general weeds, stuff that grows in untended meadows in the Levant region. Herb, the best translation I can come up with is foliage or flora. So the logic here is interesting. Is this implying that there weren't thorns and thistles before? Did God invent thorns and thistles just to piss people off? But it's agriculture. That's why you weed the gardens, to prevent stuff you don't want from growing there. So maybe this wasn't a curse on agriculture, though. Just a curse on walking through untended meadows. And maybe thorns and thistles is a kind of a turn of phrase, meaning barrenness. Verse 19, by the sweat of your face ye shall eat bread until you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you shall return. Famous verse. Linguistically speaking, by the sweat of your face, that's where we get our idiom from it, from your hard work. Bread hadn't been invented yet. So is this just a bad translation? Probably. The word for bread here is from the word lacham, which just means to eat. So it's probably just food, not necessarily bread, per se. So we'll give it a pass on that. There's not much to say about the logic here, but it seemed to be hard enough work already. I mean, it was hard enough for Adam to require a helper, at any rate. So I guess it just got harder. So, we've got a snake being punished by having to move like every snake ever. We've got the woman being punished by having more pain in childbirth than she would have had otherwise. And we have the man being punished by having to weed the fields and sweating. Okay. Verse 20, and Adam called the name of his wife Eve because she was the mother of all living. This is a deceptively short verse with a lot more meat in it than you'd think. Linguistically, Chava, Eve. That's the translation for Eve, Chava. It's from a word meaning life, which is itself from a word meaning to tell. Interesting stuff here. Chava, H-V-V-H, as it's transliterated, is also how you'd spell another word meaning serpent. Although it might be pronounced with different vowels. They pronounce it Shiva or Shiva. So it's just another play on words. Did he name Eve Snake? Was she, as the snake, the reason that human sex was invented? Interesting stuff. Interestingly, feminine energy is depicted in a lot of myths and religions and cults and occultist literature as a serpentine energy traveling up the spinal cord, going up the tree, as it were, to poison and intoxicate the mind. Really need to look into Joseph Campbell for this stuff. He is a world of wisdom. Now, you can find some fun stuff on the fringes about the symbolism of this stuff. One of my favorites is that YHWH, Yahweh, is Yod plus H, VVH. VV and W are commonly, put together. So, Yod plus Eve. Eve is a part of God in this reading, not a woman at all. It gets really weird, especially when you get into folks inventing things and saying that Jesus is Lucifer, the light bringer. This stuff gets really strange really fast. So Yod plus Eve. Is that day of life, day of the serpent? What's going on there? A whole lot of stuff to explore in that. That took me down some crazy twists and turns into theistic Satanism and all kinds of occult stuff. Cool stuff. Really interesting, but it's a labyrinthine maze with no exit. The word was here, commonly translated as would become or was. Now, was doesn't make much sense because Adam was living and Eve wasn't his mother, so we don't know if they already had kids by this point, maybe. If they hadn't had any lust, probably not, but who knows if that's the right reading. This is the same word as was in Genesis 1:2 and beyond, but again, Hebrew doesn't have a past perfect tense. So this word could be translated in a lot of different ways. It's just that here, was doesn't work because it doesn't apply to Adam. Verse 21, and Yahweh God made for Adam and his wife tunics of skin and clothed them. Tunics, easy to translate into English, of skin, same thing, hide, skin, body. Where did Yahweh God get the skins from? Had the animals already started to die immediately? Had they been dead? Was there an animal lying around to take a skin off of? Or did he just whip up some fresh skin out of nothing / the ground? Or did he use a rib? Maybe he used a skeleton rib to turn it into clothes. Mormons, at least some of them, believe that Adam and Eve didn't have physical bodies, and they were bodies of light that transformed into bodies of skin. And that's what's going on here. So I'll, of course, leave it to the Mormons to decide how people without physical bodies were eating fruit. Maybe that's just symbolism too. And it would have been hard to tend a garden without a physical body, of course, but maybe that's just a metaphor as well. And animals are given to them as helpers, so that doesn't seem right to me. It doesn't make very much sense if you're on some kind of higher astral plane and your helper is, a dog, right? Another idea I found out was that God had to kill some animals for it. So this would indicate the shedding of blood was required now in order to be righteous. And a foreshadowing of Jesus' sacrifice is going on here. Of course, Jews are going to think that's ridiculous because they don't believe in Jesus. And number two, it's ridiculous. But hey, what are you going to do? Another idea is the word lavash, used for to clothe, is a special word used to describe the clothes of priests, and that Adam and Eve were the first priests. I don't know if that's reasonable. The clothes came from God, so the clothes are going to be holy clothes by default, right? So not necessarily priestly, just holy. I mean, who would their congregation have been, after all, right? There's some more ideas, like they were clothed before in scaly skin. They had a reptilian eyelid that disappeared from the opening of their physical eyes. So, it's literally they had scales on their eyes removed. Or they were clothed in light, but then skin, or they were clothed in garments of light. Garments were made of light. All of this stuff is wildly speculative. Wildly. What it actually says, is he made them garments of skin. It doesn't say anything else. All the theological stuff here is speculation, and endlessly so. And I don't want to get too much further into that, because there's no way to do any logic on this stuff. Verse 22, and Yahweh God said, behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. Now, lest he put out his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever, ... Therefore sent him, verse 23, therefore sent God, Yahweh, out of the Garden of Eden to till the ground from which he had been taken. Oh boy, linguistically, he has become like one of us. This takes some parsing. One in this passage is a cardinal number. Normally we would say us is the royal we, as in we are not amused. But one of us? Oh, now it's different. If this was the royal interpretation, we should see he has become like us, not like one of us. So, this is where we can clearly see that there was pantheism, multiple gods, henotheism going on back then, even if Yahwists stuck the word Yahweh in there before Elohim. Remember, Yahweh has contests with other deities and is called the Lord of Hosts, and that Elohim can be plural. So if we go back and plug in the gods for everything, which we totally can, that all makes sense too. Except for there's one verb created, which is a singular verb. So maybe not all of it. But again, that's Genesis 1, and this is a different author, probably. So there's an objection to that take that I just laid out, and that's that God wasn't speaking to other gods. He was speaking to an angel that was hanging out nearby, or his heavenly court. He has a heavenly court or something, which is a strange thing to say, because God was in the garden physically. So his heavenly court was also there. Did he walk around with a courtroom or a palace or whatever? He was walking, and then the story just teleports him to the astral plane for convenience out of nowhere. That doesn't quite work for me. So no, I don't think that he was talking to his heavenly court. Maybe he was talking to an angel who knew good from evil, but that is a very strange interpretation. A very strange passage. Another possible objection here is God wasn't talking to anybody else. He was talking to himself. Of course, God is a trinity. He's three beings in one. Of course, Jews don't believe this, and of course, Adam heard him, so there's no theology of a trinity at this time. Not for a long time. So, no. Now, the word lest, this is a weird translation. A better one might be, basically, let's transliterate it. Oh no, he knows good and evil now. What if he also takes the tree of life and lives forever? Speaking of and lives forever, probably this means forever, as it's translated, but it comes from a word meaning age, also known as eon. Now, we might get into the whole zeitgeist thing later. It's not particularly reliable thing. It makes some good points, though. And astrotheology is a way bigger thing than we tend to think that it is. And there might be some validity to some of the stuff in the Zeitgeist film. If you haven't seen it, it's worth checking out, and keep a big old grain of salt nearby because you'll need it. But we'll get to that later. So logical questions here. Why couldn't God let Adam and Eve eat from the tree of life now that they knew good and evil? The serpent described this knowledge as if it would cause them to be like God. Was this true somehow? Is God just a dude walking around that knows right from wrong? That's not a very good superpower. One explanation says that God didn't want them to live forever because they'd be doing so while cut off from God by sin. That's better, I think. Only by their corrupted bodies dying could they be redeemed. But what kind of corruption is it if the corruption turns you into somebody more like God? I wonder. If it was the heavenly host God was talking to, there were tons of lesser beings that knew good from evil and lived eternity, and that wasn't a problem for them. Well, they were like God, so what's the problem? It can't be, a Highlander. There can be only one setup, where there's only one being that can have the knowledge and live forever, if he's talking to a heavenly host or an angel or whatever, or other gods. We need to try to steelman these arguments, though. So the best I can come up with is that they gained a knowledge of evil, and together with the fleshly inclinations, that was enough to make them desire evil things and turn bad, or have the capability to turn bad. But the sin was the acquisition of knowledge itself. And the only bad thing they'd done, from one perspective maybe, is to cover up their bits. But, okay, whatever, let's just say that. To the pure, all things are pure. And they weren't pure anymore, because they gained a new dimension of understanding. They knew what evil was, so they couldn't be pure anymore. I don't like that, but it more or less works. Let's get to the end of this. Verse 24. So he drove out the man, and he placed to the east of the Garden of Eden cherubim and a sword of flame whirling to guard the way to the tree of life. Cherubim is also plural, cherubim, as in Elohim, of cherub. We will have to see later the description of these cuddly little fellows. But they're pretty terrifying. Something straight out of a DMT trip. Wild-looking, crazy stuff. A sword is a sword. Not that Adam and Eve would have had reference for what a sword was to report it, but okay. So whirling means literally turning over. Whirling is a good translation. East indicates that the only entrance was on the eastern side, which means it was up against some kind of barrier somewhere, one would think. So, the logic here is, so the tree later disappeared. Nobody can find the tree. Nobody can find the cherubim either, despite looking everywhere. People used to go around looking for this stuff. So why did he need a tree of life on Earth if nobody was going to eat from it? He could have just removed it and stashed it somewhere. But again, maybe not, because Earth is the only physical plane. There's no other planets anywhere that had to stay on Earth. But anyway, there we have it. The serpent was more cunning than all the other beasts of the field, of which he was one. He asks Eve, hey, God didn't really say you can't eat all the fruit here, right? She says, we cannot eat all the fruit except for that one. We don't even touch that one. Satan says, oh, that's silly. God knows that if you eat it, you'll be wise like him. So Eve takes a look at the fruit and golly gee, does it look good? So she eats some and gives it to Adam, and he eats some also. She doesn't actually, there's no word on whether she told him where she got the fruit. Maybe it was just pure deception. And so anyway, all of a sudden they realize that nobody's invented clothes yet. And they get embarrassed about their bits hanging out in front of absolutely nobody. So Then God is chilling in his physical body in the garden, and they hide because they don't want him to see them naked, which he has a bunch of times already. And he asks where they are, probably because he's in a body and not omnipotent and doesn't have X-ray vision and doesn't know. So they tell him, "Yeah, we're naked over here," and he's like, "Well, who told you about clothes? Did you eat the fruit of the knowledge of fashion?" And Adam blames Eve for tricking him into eating it. Eve blames the talking snake. God punishes the talking snake by making him lose his legs and presumably his voice box, although that's not mentioned. And he punishes Eve by making conception a lot more work, and he punishes Adam by making agriculture a lot more work. And then God realizes if they stay around there, they'll be one of his kind and live forever, and that's not okay. They have to die, or else something. I don't know what on earth could threaten God. So he sends the first humans off, not to hunt and gather, as is depicted in anthropological activity, but to do agriculture. Forget about the cave paintings. And he guards the tree from being eaten by a set of terrifying, eye-bedazzled nightmares and a swirly sword, and ends up disappearing the tree anyway, which he could have just done to begin with. So that's the story of how we started farming, boys and girls. Now, is any of this good enough for you? It's good enough for God, but it's not good enough for me. And I don't think it's good enough for you either.